The Aurora Empress was the kind of ship built for romance. Its polished decks gleamed under the soft glow of string lights. Champagne flutes clinked in the lounge, and the crisp Alaskan air carried the scent of salt and adventure. To the hundreds of couples on board, it was a floating paradise, the perfect place to start a lifetime together. For Rick Dawson and his new bride, Alana Torres, it was supposed to be exactly that. They'd only known each other for 7 months before walking down the aisle, but Rick swore to anyone who'd listen that sometimes love didn't follow a calendar. She was beautiful, sweet, and made him feel seen in a way he hadn't since before his divorce. They'd met on a dating app last fall. Rick had been scrolling absent-mindedly after a long day on a job site when her profile stopped him cold. A warm smile, deep brown eyes, and a line in her bio that read, "Looking for someone who values family above all." Her name was Alana, 28 years old, a nurse from the Philippines here on a work visa. Their first date was coffee near the waterfront, and he still remembered how she'd shown up in a red windbreaker, her black hair pulled into a neat ponytail, laughing shyly when he teased her about how Seattle rain was nothing compared to tropical storms. Rick liked that she listened more than she talked, that she seemed genuinely curious about him, his work, his family, the way he took his coffee. She never complained, even when he had to reschedule because of a job. When her work hours at the care home got cut, he helped her with rent. When her visa clock started ticking down, he told her not to worry. "Marry me," he'd said one night over takeout noodles, and she'd covered her mouth in shock before nodding, eyes brimming with tears. By the time they stood in a small Tacoma chapel saying "I do," Rick felt like he'd beaten the odds. The honeymoon was his idea, a week cruising through Alaska's glaciers, where the air was sharp and clean and the nights promised champagne under the northern lights. The first 2 days were bliss. They ate too much, laughed too loud, and slept in late, the ocean rocking them in their cabin on deck 8. Neither of them could have known that by the time the ship reached the icy waters north of Juneau, only one of them would be alive to see the shore. It was the third night of the cruise, and the Aurora Empress moved through a stretch of dark, glassy water, the moonlight breaking into silver shards on the waves. The air outside was biting, but in their stateroom, it was warm, dimmed lights, the muffled hum of the engines, and 2 half-filled champagne flutes sweating on the table. Rick had been waiting for this moment since they'd exchanged vows. They'd kissed plenty before, but Alana had always stopped things from going further, saying she wanted to save it for the wedding night. He'd respected that, maybe even admired it. Now, on their honeymoon, there were no more reasons to wait. She was still in a silky blue dress she'd worn to dinner, her skin glowing from the wine, her laugh soft and easy as she slipped off her heels. Rick set his glass down, crossed the space between them, and kissed her, feeling her hands rest on his shoulders. The ship rocked gently beneath them, the sound of water lapping against the hull. Then his hand slid lower and froze. Something wasn't right. His brows knit, confusion replacing desire. He pulled back just enough to look at her. "Alana, what?" Her eyes flickered with panic. She stepped back, clutching the edge of the bed for balance. I should have told you before," she said, her voice trembling. "Before what?" His tone sharpened. She took a breath like she was diving into cold water. "When I was 17, there was a bus crash. In Cebu, I was trapped under metal and glass for hours. The injuries that she stopped swallowing hard. They had to remove everything. I don't have." Alana's voice faltered, but the words had already begun to open a door she'd kept bolted for over a decade. Her mind drifted back to the heat of that August day in Cebu, the smell of gasoline and scorched rubber still so vivid she could almost taste it. She'd been sitting in the back of the bus, earphones in, daydreaming about nursing school. Then came the screech of brakes, the blur of a truck swerving across the lane, and the world turned into fire and glass. When she woke, she couldn't move. Her body was pinned beneath a twisted seat frame, her right leg numb, her chest so tight she thought her lungs had collapsed. Somewhere nearby, someone was screaming her name, her cousin, Maribel, until the sound broke off into silence. The rescue took hours. Heat pressed down on her, sweat stinging her eyes. The metallic tang of blood filled her mouth. She tried to stay awake, to think about the future, but every time she closed her eyes, she imagined her mother's face, and the guilt was like a weight on her ribs. By the time they pulled her free, the damage had already been done. Internal bleeding, shattered pelvic bones, infections that spread faster than the doctors could fight them. The surgeon had been blunt, maybe too blunt for a 17-year-old girl. "We saved your life," he'd said, "but you won't be able to carry children. In sexual function, it will never be the same." She nodded like she understood, but inside, her world collapsed in on itself. In the weeks that followed, she refused visitors, speaking only to her mother in short, clipped phrases. She'd stopped looking in mirrors. Every reflection felt like a reminder of what had been taken. Years later, when she arrived in the U.S. on a work visa, she'd learned how to smile again, to hide the shadow behind her eyes. But dating was a battlefield. Men wanted to talk about kids on the second date, or they'd ask casual questions about the future that made her stomach twist. Sometimes she'd try to be honest, only to watch their faces shudder, their interest evaporate in minutes. By the time she met Rick, she had mastered the art of omission. She let him talk about his job, his family, the house he was remodeling. She asked questions, laughed at his dry humor, touched his arm when he told a story. She told herself she would tell him, eventually, maybe after a few more dates, maybe once she was sure he saw her as more than a body that didn't work the way others did. But then he said he loved her. Then he proposed, and the fear roared back, the same suffocating fear she'd felt under that seat frame in Cebu, the dread of watching everything slip away in an instant. She told herself silence wasn't lying. It was protecting herself, protecting them. Now, in this warm, stay-true miles from shore, she saw in his eyes that her silence had been a match held over gasoline. The truth had finally been spoken, and there was no taking it back. Rick blinked, not fully processing. "You mean you can't? I can't have sex. I can't have children. I wanted to tell you, but I didn't want to lose you." Her voice broke on the last words. For a long moment, there was only the hum of the ship. Then Rick's face darkened. "You let me marry you without saying a damn thing." "I was scared," she pleaded. You thought I'd find out after the papers went through? After you had your green card? After you had access to my bank account?" His voice was rising, his chest tightening. Her eyes filled with tears. "It's not like that. Don't lie to me, Alana." He was on his feet now, pacing, his hands raking through his hair. The warmth in the room had vanished, replaced by a suffocating tension. The ship still rocked, but it no longer felt like a lullaby. It felt like a warning. She reached for him, but he pulled away. "Rick, please." "Please what?" His voice was a low growl. "Pretend this isn't the biggest lie anyone's ever told me." Outside, the black ocean stretched endlessly, cold and merciless. Inside, in a cabin meant for newlyweds, something far darker was beginning to take shape. Rick's voice was no longer just angry. It was shaking, edged with something raw and dangerous. "You made me stand in front of my family, say vows, bring you here, and all the while you knew." Alana's shoulders were trembling now. She wrapped her arms around herself, as if she could shield her body from the words he was throwing like knives. "I didn't want to lose you, Rick. Every time I thought about telling you, I saw you walking away." "You're damn right I would have walked away," he snapped, stepping closer. "Because you lied. You stole my choice. It wasn't stealing, she said, her voice breaking. It was surviving. You don't know what it's like to wake up in a hospital bed and realize you'll never be the same. I just wanted someone to see me as more than my body. For a second, just a second, he hesitated. There was something in her eyes that looked less like deception and more like desperation. But then another thought slammed into him. The rushed engagement, her sudden move into his house, the casual questions about his life insurance policy. His jaw clenched. The doubt was gone. This whole marriage, this was about a visa and a bank account, he said, his tone flat and cold now. That's not true, she shouted, her hands shaking as she reached for him again. I love you, Rick. Please, just listen. He shoved her hands away. I've heard enough. The ship's gentle sway made the shadows shift across the walls, the warm cabin light suddenly feeling dim and suffocating. Outside, waves hit the hull in slow, heavy slaps, the sound like a heartbeat counting down to something inevitable. Alana's breathing quickened. You're scaring me. Good, he said, and something in his voice made her step back. Her calves hit the edge of the bed. She sat down hard, eyes darting toward the cabin door. Rick moved closer. His shadow swallowed hers on the wall. You know what you did, he said, almost in a whisper now. You know you ruined everything. Her lips parted to speak. He lunged, hands on her throat. Tight, she gasped, nails digging into his skin. He squeezed harder. Her breath broke into short, sharp sounds. The room seemed to close in, walls pressing closer, the air thinning. Her kick slowed, eyes wide, pleading. Rick felt the sudden, unnatural weight in his hands. Rick's grip loosened. She slumped back, motionless. His chest heaved. The muffled clink of a champagne flute wobbled on the table. He stared at her for a beat too long, then bent, hooked his arms under hers. The balcony door slid open. A blast of freezing air hit him in the face. Below, the ocean waited black, endless. He shoved her over. Gone. No splash he could hear, only the hiss of the wind. For a long moment, Rick stood frozen, hands gripping the balcony railing so tightly his knuckles turned white. The cold wind cut into his face, but he barely felt it. Below, the black water rippled like a living thing, swallowing what he had done without a sound. His breath came in ragged bursts. He told himself to move, to close the door, to hide the evidence, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. Somewhere deep in the ship, he could hear the faint thump of music. From the lounge, the muffled laughter of strangers who had no idea that a life had just ended a few feet from where they sipped champagne. She lied. He whispered to no one. The words slipped out on instinct, as if speaking them aloud might transform them into a shield against the guilt pressing into his chest. She used me. He said it again, louder this time, until the syllables felt almost rehearsed, like a line in a play where he was the wronged man, the victim of a cruel trick. But no matter how he shaped the story in his head, the image kept forcing itself back into his mind, her eyes wide and wet, her hands clawing at his wrists, the desperate rasp of her breath as she tried to speak. The sound had already begun to echo, looping in his skull like a piece of music he didn't want to remember. Rick stepped back into the cabin, sliding the balcony door shut with a faint clack. The warmth of the room hit him like a wave, thick and suffocating. He noticed the champagne glasses still on the table, one of them tilted precariously. A bead of condensation slid down its side and pooled onto the wood. His eyes scanned the room automatically, cataloging the mess, the half-pulled bedsheet, the faint marks on the carpet leading to the balcony. His brain ticked through the possibilities. Wipe the railing. Get rid of the sheet. Make it look like she left. He moved quickly, almost gratefully, as if the act of cleaning could drown out the images in his head. He balled the sheet in his hands, the fabric still faintly warm, and shoved it under the bed for now. He grabbed a towel from the bathroom, ran it under hot water, and began scrubbing the carpet in short, harsh strokes. The reddish blotches faded, but didn't disappear entirely. Somewhere in the middle of this frantic motion, he stopped and stared at himself in the mirror above the desk. His face looked pale, drawn, almost unfamiliar. There was a thin red line on his neck where her nails had caught him. His jaw twitched as he tilted his head, trying to see himself not as he was, but as someone else might. A man on his honeymoon, alone in his cabin, with a story he'd need to sell to anyone who asked. Rick sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, and pressed his palms to his face. The hum of the ship seemed louder now, almost accusatory. He wondered if she was still sinking, if the cold had already numbed her body before the darkness swallowed her whole. The thought should have horrified him, but instead it left him hollow, like something inside had already died. Minutes passed, maybe more. He lost track of time until a muffled announcement came over the PA, something about a midnight buffet on Deck 5. The mundanity of it struck him like a slap. Life was still moving on around him, the ship still gliding forward, as if the world refused to pause for what had just happened in cabin 823. Rick changed into clean clothes, dark jeans, a sweater, and shoved the dirty ones into a suitcase. He poured the remaining champagne down the bathroom sink, rinsing the glasses and setting them neatly back on the table. He even opened the curtains, letting the faint light of the moon spill across the cabin, as if staging a scene for an audience that might never come. But deep down, he knew someone would come. And when they did, he'd have to be ready. Keep it simple, he muttered to himself. She left. We argued. She stormed out. I went to bed. He tried in different tones. Angry, sad, confused. Again and again, until one finally sounded believable. Still, when he finally lay down, the bed felt foreign, hostile. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her again, sometimes in the silky blue dress she'd worn to dinner, sometimes in the red windbreaker from their first date, always looking at him like she knew exactly what he was about to do. By the time the first gray hint of dawn seeped through the curtains, Rick's throat was dry and his eyes burned. He told himself he could still walk away from this, still make it to Juneau, to the airport, to home. All he had to do was keep his story straight and his face calm. But somewhere in the back of his mind, another voice, quieter but sharper, whispered the truth. You're not walking away from this. Not ever. Rick closed the balcony door and stood there in the silence. The cabin suddenly too quiet, too still, and yet somehow unbearably loud. The next morning, the Aurora Empress glided toward the icy silhouettes of Juneau's mountains, the deck wet from a night mist. Passengers in fleece jackets and knit hats gathered at the railings, pointing at the snow caps in the distance. Inside cabin 823, the curtains were drawn and the Do Not Disturb sign still hung on the handle. At 7:12 a.m., Maria, a young steward from Manila, wheeled her breakfast cart down the hall. She stopped outside 823, balancing a tray of pancakes and coffee, and knocked lightly. Room service, she called. Silence. She knocked again, harder this time. The latch stayed shut, but in the sliver between door and carpet, Maria noticed something, a faint, reddish smear no bigger than a coin. She frowned. Salt water sometimes stained the carpet, but not this deep, rusty color. She decided not to linger. Guests could get cranky if she woke them too early. By mid-morning, Maria returned with housekeeping. The Do Not Disturb sign was gone now. She knocked once more, then opened the door with her passkey. The moment the door swung inward, a chill hit her, not from the air, but from the strange heaviness in the room. The bed was stripped bare except for a single pillow. The champagne glasses from the night before still sat on the table, one knocked slightly askew. And there, leading from the bed toward the balcony, was a faint trail, small blotches of dried brown on the carpet, irregular but clearly connected. Maria froze. "Call security," she whispered to the other attendant. Maria's heart was thudding so hard she thought the other attendant might hear it. She had worked on the Aurora Empress for almost 4 years, long enough to know that strange things happened on cruise ships, passengers getting drunk and passing out in the hallways, couples having loud arguments, even the occasional medical emergency. But this felt different. She took a step back into the hallway, pressing her palm to her stomach to steady herself. The smell inside cabin 823 lingered in her nostrils, a faint metallic tang that didn't belong in a room that should have smelled of champagne and fresh linens. Her mind raced. She thought about knocking again, just to be sure, but the sight of those dried brown stains pulled her back. The other attendant, a younger man named Carlos, glanced at her nervously. "You think it's—" He didn't finish the question. "I don't know," Maria whispered, "but it's not normal, and we don't touch anything." By the time Ed Rourke, the security chief, arrived, Maria had already replayed the scene a dozen times in her head. She watched him move through the room with quick, deliberate steps, the kind of steps that said he'd seen worse but didn't like what he was finding. When he crouched near the balcony railing, Maria's skin prickled. She had never seen him look like that, eyes narrowing, jaw tightening, before giving a single, clipped order, "Get the captain." Maria stepped back further into the hallway, leaning against the wall. Passengers walked by, chatting about breakfast and glacier tours, completely unaware that just a few feet away, something dark was unfolding. Her thoughts drifted back to the night before. She remembered passing this same cabin on her way back to the service pantry. The Do Not Disturb sign had already been out. She'd heard faint sounds, maybe a voice, maybe two, but the hallway had been noisy with laughter from a group heading to the late-night buffet. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now, the memory felt heavier, sharper, like a puzzle piece snapping into place too late to change anything. When the captain's voice crackled over the staff radio, Maria felt a shiver run down her spine. Words like missing passenger, security lockdown, and Coast Guard notification cut through the static. The ship suddenly felt smaller, the walls tighter. She realized that every door she passed now held a question mark. Who was inside? And who might be next? As the hours crawled forward, Maria found herself avoiding Deck 8 unless she absolutely had to go there. But the whispers still found her. Crew members talking in the galley, bartenders swapping rumors in low voices. Some said it was a fight gone too far. Others said it was about money. A few even muttered about visa marriages, their words tinged with judgment. Maria didn't care about the reasons. She just couldn't stop picturing the reddish smear by the balcony door and wondering how cold the water must have been when it swallowed the missing woman. She thought of her own mother back in Manila, how she called every Sunday without fail. And she thought about what it would be like if one day that call came from a stranger telling her that her daughter had vanished somewhere between two ports. That night, long after her shift ended, Maria sat in her small crew cabin, staring at the wall. The hum of the ship's engines was steady beneath her feet, the same as it had been every night for years. But now, every creak of the hull, every groan of the metal felt different. Less like the heartbeat of ship and more like the slow, restless breath of something that had just witnessed a secret. And Maria knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would never forget the smell of cabin 823. Within minutes, the ship's security chief, a stocky man named Ed Rourke, stepped inside. He scanned the room quickly, his eyes settling on the balcony. He slid open the glass door, stepped out, and crouched near the railing. There, another smear, almost hidden by the cold condensation. Dark, crusted, and unmistakable. "Get the captain," Ed said. "Now." By noon, the Aurora Empress was no longer just a honeymoon cruise. It was a potential crime scene. The captain contacted the U.S. Coast Guard, reporting a missing passenger. Other guests began to talk. Word traveled fast on a ship where boredom bred gossip. A retired police officer from Oregon approached security, saying he'd seen the man from 823 pacing the hallway barefoot around 2 in the morning, his hands shaking, his skin pale. Another couple claimed they'd been woken by raised voices, male shouting, female crying, and then sudden silence. The sea that had looked so peaceful now felt ominous. Somewhere out there, in the black, freezing depths, was a body. And on deck 8, in a cabin that smelled faintly of stale champagne and cold air, the first pieces of the truth were beginning to surface. By the time the Aurora Empress eased into the harbor at Juneau, 2 Coast Guard cutters were already waiting. The sky was the color of steel, the air sharp enough to sting the lungs. Passengers lined the rails, craning their necks at the sight of uniformed officers boarding the ship. Rick stood near the gangway, hands stuffed in his jacket pockets, trying to look like any other tourist ready to disembark. He told himself to breathe evenly, keep his eyes forward. He just needed to get to the airport, fly home, and this would all fade like a bad dream. "Richard Dawson?" The voice came from behind him. Rick turned to see 2 men in dark blue uniforms, Coast Guard insignia stitched neatly over their chests. One of them held a clipboard. "Yeah," Rick said, forcing a small smile. "You'll need to come with us, sir," the officer said. "We have a few questions about your wife." Rick's stomach clenched. "What about her?" "She's been reported missing. Please follow us." They let him not off the ship, but deeper inside, to a narrow room in the security wing. A table sat in the center, a single chair on each side. On the wall, a monitor displayed grainy black and white footage. Rick walking into his cabin at 1:47 a.m., his face tense, hair mussed, shoulders hunched. The clip looped over and over. The ship's security chief, Ed Rourke, entered with a small evidence bag. Inside were 2 items, a bloodstained bedsheet and a swab from the balcony railing. "These were found in your cabin, Mr. Dawson," Rourke said flatly. Rick shrugged, trying to keep his voice calm. "We cut ourselves once or twice, just an accident." The Coast Guard officer didn't blink. "Your wife's body was recovered this morning by our crew. She had deep bruising around the neck and burst blood vessels in her eyes. That's not consistent with a fall overboard." Rick's eyes darted toward the floor. His hands began to sweat. The officer leaned in. "We also have witnesses who heard a violent argument in your cabin last night. Shouting, crying, then silence." Rick swallowed hard. "We fought." She stormed out. "I figured she was cooling off somewhere." "Cooling off?" the officer repeated, his tone heavy. "In the North Pacific?" "At 2 in the morning." The room felt smaller by the second. Outside the narrow porthole, the water was calm, almost mocking in its stillness. "We're placing you under arrest for suspicion of murder," the officer said. He motioned to another guard, who stepped forward with handcuffs. The cold metal bit into Rick's wrists, and for the first time since the night before, he realized there was no version of this where he walked away free. Outside, the weather turned. The one steady sea churned under a low, gray sky. Wind howled along the decks, rattling loose signs and making the rigging groan. From the portholes of the security wing, the water looked thick and leaden, as if it could swallow anything without leaving a ripple. Passengers stayed indoors, their conversations hushed, their eyes flicking toward the cabin where security worked behind closed doors. The smell of salt and diesel clung to the hallways. Somewhere deep in the ship, a steel door slammed in rhythm with the waves. Even for those who knew nothing yet, the air felt wrong. Heavy, electric, like the moment before a storm. The trial drew a crowd from the very first day. Reporters packed the benches, sketch artists sharpened their pencils, and the public filled every spare seat just to watch the man accused of killing his bride on their honeymoon. Rick sat at the defense table in a pressed gray suit, his hair neatly combed, his eyes fixed on the wood grain in front of him. If he looked up, he would have seen the photos the prosecution had pinned to the display board, the blood trail across the cabin carpet, the smear on the balcony railing, and a shot of Alana's lifeless body being pulled from the icy water. The medical examiner was the first to testify. Her tone was clinical, almost detached, as she explained the marks on Alana's neck. Deep bruising from thumb and finger pressure, burst capillaries in the whites of her eyes, and a fractured hyoid bone. All of these, she said, are consistent with manual strangulation. She was dead before she entered the water. Next came Maria, the steward who had first seen the reddish smear near the cabin door. She sat stiffly in the witness chair, her hands twisting in her lap. "I brought breakfast," she said softly. No one answered. I thought maybe they were sleeping, but I saw the stain. It didn't look right. When asked if she'd ever seen anything like it before, she shook her head. Not on this ship. Not like that. Then a retired police officer from Oregon took the stand. His voice was steady, deliberate. I couldn't sleep, so I walked the hall. I saw the defendant, barefoot, pacing, talking to himself. He looked pale, sweaty, like a man in shock, or a man trying to figure out what to do next. The prosecution played the hallway security footage on a large screen. The grainy black and white image showed Rick leaving his cabin briefly, pacing with his hands on his head, then going back inside. He never came out again until morning. When it was Rick's turn to testify, he leaned heavily into the microphone. "I didn't mean to hurt her," he said, his voice low. "I found out something life-changing. I wasn't thinking straight. I just snapped." His attorney tried to paint a picture of a man betrayed, blindsided by a devastating secret. But the prosecutor pounced. "You had options, Mr. Dawson," she said, her voice cutting through the courtroom. "You could have walked out that cabin door. You could have gone to the captain. You could have filed for annulment. Instead, you put your hand around her throat. Why?" Rick's fingers tightened around the edge of the witness stand. The wood felt rough under his palms, but it was nothing compared to the heat creeping up his neck. He tried to meet the prosecutor's eyes, but her gaze was steady, sharp enough to slice through every excuse he'd rehearsed. His voice cracked, and he swallowed hard. "I wasn't thinking. I was hurt. I felt." "You felt?" she interrupted, taking a step closer. "Betrayed? Humiliated? Angry?" "Yes," he said quickly, as if agreeing might make her stop. "And because you felt those things, you decided her life no longer had value?" The defense attorney rose. "Objection," argumentative. "Sustained," the judge said, but her tone lacked conviction, as if she too was waiting for the answer. The prosecutor shifted tactics. She picked up a photograph from the evidence table, Alana's smiling face in her nursing uniform, hair pulled back, stethoscope around her neck, and held it up for the jury. "This is the woman you married, Mr. Dawson. A woman who cared for the sick and elderly. A woman who survived a devastating accident at 17. You knew none of this because you never asked until it was too late. But when she finally told you, you didn't try to understand. You didn't walk away. You killed her." Rick's jaw flexed. "She lied to me from the start." The prosecutor set the photo down with deliberate care. "And that lie, in your mind, was worth a death sentence." He opened his mouth, but the words tangled on his tongue. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. From the gallery, Alana's mother leaned forward, her knuckles white as she gripped the back of the bench in front of her. One of Alana's brothers reached over to steady her, but her eyes never left Rick. The defense attorney finally stepped in, pacing slowly in front of the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, my client is not denying his actions. What we ask you to consider is why. Mr. Dawson was blindsided by a revelation that would shake any marriage to its core. In a matter of seconds, he went from believing he had a life partner to believing he'd been deceived in the most intimate way possible. He reacted poorly, tragically, but without premeditation. This is not first-degree murder. This is a crime of passion." The prosecutor stood again, her voice rising. "A crime of passion still leaves someone dead, and it still leaves a family staring at an empty chair for the rest of their lives. And the defendant's so-called passion involved strangling a woman until the life drained from her body, then pushing her into freezing water in the middle of the night. That is not a momentary lapse. That is calculated. That is murder." She turned to Rick. "Tell the jury, Mr. Dawson, how long did you hold your hands around her neck? How many seconds did you count in your head before she stopped moving? Long enough to feel her struggling stop? Long enough to know she was gone before you shoved her over that railing?" Rick's chest rose and fell, but he didn't answer. "Or maybe," she continued, her voice now quiet but searing, "you've been counting the seconds in your head every night since." A murmur ran through the gallery. The judge called for order, but the tension in the room was electric. Every eye locked on the man in the witness stand. Rick finally looked at the jury, his lips parting. "I didn't mean to, but you did," the prosecutor said, cutting him off one last time. In the back row, a reporter scribbled furiously, already knowing this exchange would be the centerpiece of tomorrow's headlines. The judge dismissed Rick from the stand, and he returned to the defense table, shoulders hunched. His attorney leaned in, whispering something meant to reassure him, but his gaze stayed fixed on the floor. Across the aisle, Alana's family sat like stone, unmoving, unblinking. When closing arguments began, the prosecutor painted the cabin as a pressure cooker, a locked room, miles from shore, where secrets and tempers collided. She told the jury that the ocean outside was cold and endless, but not nearly as cold as the choice the defendant made that night. The defense countered by appealing to human fallibility, describing Rick as a man caught in a storm of betrayal and emotion, urging the jury to see the difference between premeditation and reaction. But as the jurors filed out to deliberate, the weight of the evidence hung in the air like a dense fog. No one, not the judge, not the attorneys, not even Rick, seemed to believe it would take long. And they were right. Rick opened his mouth, but no words came. The silence stretched, heavy and damning. The jury watched him closely. They'd seen the photographs, heard the witnesses, and listened to the expert testimony. Now, all they saw was a man with no answer. The jury was out for less than a day. When they filed back into the courtroom, their faces were unreadable, but the tension in the air was suffocating. Rick sat motionless at the defense table, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. Across the aisle, Alana's family, her mother, 2 brothers, and a cousin who had flown in from the Philippines, held each other's hands in a tight knot. The foreman stood, a slip of paper in his hand. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Richard Dawson, guilty of murder in the first degree." A sharp gasp broke from Alana's mother, her shoulders shaking as silent tears ran down her cheeks. Rick's jaw flexed, but his face stayed otherwise blank, as if he'd been expecting it all along. The judge's voice was steady as she read the sentence. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Reporters rushed out of the courtroom to call in the verdict. By the time the court recessed, headlines were already hitting news sites. Honeymoon cruise turns to murder, husband sentenced to life. The case lit up morning talk shows and true crime forums. On one side were those who called Rick a monster, a man who valued his pride over a human life. On the other were voices insisting that Alana's secrecy was a betrayal that pushed him over the edge. But even in those debates, most agreed betrayal was not a death sentence. Outside the courthouse, Alana's mother stood before the microphones, clutching a framed photograph of her daughter in her nursing uniform. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "My daughter survived an accident that should have taken her life. She came to America to start over. She never made a home. I will never forgive him." Rick was led from the courthouse in chains, the flash of cameras lighting his face as deputies guided him into the waiting transport van. Through the tinted window, he caught one last glimpse of the sky, gray and cold, like the waters where he'd thrown her. For the public, the story became more than a crime. It was a cautionary tale about secrets, about trust, and about how quickly love can turn deadly when trapped in a locked room miles from shore. Winter returned to Alaska months after the trial, and the Aurora Empress sailed her route as if nothing had ever happened. Couples still lined the railings, bundled in scarves, their cheeks flushed from the cold. Glasses still clinked in the lounge. The same stretch of black, icy water slid past the hull, silent and endless. Somewhere beneath those waves lay the place where Alana Torres had disappeared into the dark, her body claimed by a sea that gave her back only long enough for the world to see what had been done. Passengers who booked cabin 823 now often asked to switch after hearing whispers from the crew about muffled arguments, about footsteps pacing in the hall, about the way the balcony door sometimes rattled in calm weather. In the Philippines, Alana's mother kept her daughter's wedding photo on a small altar in the corner of her home. Every evening, she lit a single candle, the flame reflecting in the glass, and prayed, not for Rick's forgiveness, but for her daughter's peace. She said the ocean still haunted her dreams, cold and endless. Rick Dawson will spend the rest of his life behind bars, trading the open horizon for cinder block walls and the steady clang of steel doors. No one will ever know exactly what went through his mind in those final moments in the cabin, whether it was rage, humiliation, or the crushing weight of a secret he couldn't accept. What's certain is this: the ocean keeps no promises, and on a ship miles from land, there are no neighbors to knock on the door when love turns violent. There's only the wind, the dark water below, and the truth waiting to surface, no matter how deep you try to sink it. In the months after his conviction, Rick's name all but vanished from the headlines, replaced by the next sensational case. But in the small, gray-walled cell where he now woke each morning, time moved differently. He marked the days in short pencil strokes on the inside of a locker door, each line a reminder that the life he'd imagined, houses he planned to build, trips he'd thought he'd take with his wife, had been erased the moment his hands closed around her throat. Inside prison, there were no cruise ship sunsets or soft sheets, only the sour smell of bleach and the constant echo of doors slamming. Other inmates had heard his story. Some mocked him for killing a woman who, by his own account, had loved him. Others avoided him, convinced there was something darker behind his blank stare. Rick never spoke about Alana, not to the prison counselors, not to his cellmate, not to himself. But sometimes in the middle of the night, he'd jolt awake with the taste of cold air in his mouth and the sound of water, thick, black, and swallowing. Outside the walls, the people who had once debated his guilt had moved on. The Aurora Empress still sailed from Seattle, her deck scrubbed clean, her cabins booked months in advance. Cabin 823 remained part of the rotation, but the crew knew its story. They said no amount of carpet shampoo could fully lift the faint, rust-colored shadow by the balcony door. And in the Philippines, Alana's mother continued her nightly ritual at the altar, whispering the same prayer she had since the day she learned her daughter's body had been found. It wasn't for vengeance anymore. It wasn't even for justice. It was for the truth to be remembered, because the truth was all that was left of her. In the end, the lesson of their story wasn't about visas or money or even the secret that had sparked it all. It was about how quickly love can turn to violence when honesty is absent, and how once a life is taken, there's no taking it back. The sea had carried Alana away in seconds. The rest of the world would carry her name for much longer. Every true crime story leaves behind a shadow, and this one clung stubbornly to every place it touched. The court files, the crime scene photos, the autopsy report, all of it sat locked away in archives, but the ripples were still moving. Somewhere out there, a young couple was boarding a cruise ship, believing their love was unshakable. Somewhere else, someone was holding onto a secret, praying it would never be exposed. For those who knew Alana, the shadow was personal. Friend from nursing school in Cebu still posted old photos of her online. Laughing in a cafeteria, hair pulled back, a stethoscope around her neck. In the captions, they wrote about how she'd been the one who stayed behind after class to help others study, the one who remembered birthdays and brought snacks for everyone. It was a version of her no jury or headline had ever really seen. For those who knew Rick, the shadow was heavier. His old neighbors in Seattle avoided mentioning his name. A few who'd been close enough to see the inside of his home said they remembered the pride in his voice when he talked about marrying the sweetest woman on earth. That pride was gone now, replaced by a silence that stretched from his prison cell to every place he used to stand. The Aurora Empress kept sailing, her dining rooms still filled with music and champagne. But for the crew who had worked that voyage, the memory was etched in their routines. Maria, the steward, said she never looked at a do not disturb sign the same way again. Ed Rourke, the security chief, retired the following year. Some things, he told a friend, you just don't forget. In the end, the story wasn't just about a man who killed his wife. It was about the thin line between love and possession, about how a single moment of rage can drag two lives, one into the ocean, the other into a cell, forever. And as the Alaskan waters rolled on, cold and endless, they carried the weight of a secret that had destroyed a marriage before it had truly begun. A secret that, once spoken, was followed by silence, and then the sound of waves closing over the truth. In the end, if there's one thing the story of Rick and Alana should teach us, it's this: you cannot build love on a lie. Alana kept her truth hidden, fearing rejection. Rick let his anger decide her fate. Both choices collided in a locked cabin miles from shore, and the result was a tragedy no one could undo. Secrets might seem small at first, hidden away to avoid pain or rejection, but they grow in the dark. They twist trust into suspicion, affection into resentment. And when the truth finally comes out, it doesn't just break hearts, it can destroy lives. Honesty isn't always easy. It can be uncomfortable, even terrifying. But it's the only way two people can truly choose each other for who they are, not for who they pretend to be. If you love someone, give them the truth. If you can't give them that, then you're not giving them love at all.